So we're talking about what is the church. And here we go. Today's topic is actually Augustine and the beginnings of the characteristic of the part of Christendom that Anglicanism comes through, the Western Church. And we started to see that there already were some differences between the mostly Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. And our next time, we're going to go back to the East for Church Councils 5, 6, 7, and forward. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about probably the most important person in the history of certainly Western thought, and that would be St. Augustine. I want to talk a little bit about his biography. And since my focus has been mainly to talk about sort of from a historical point of view, what is the church, I want to focus on some of the aspects of his thought that have to do with some of the church controversies that really in some ways defined the way that we think and talk about that question, including about defining the church itself, who is the church, what is the sacraments, coming on a few other theological points on which his thinking has been deeply influential, both for Roman Catholics and Protestants. And in the last few minutes, I want to say at least a few things of sort of how that starts to develop to kind of point us forward to future meetings as we go on. So St. Augustine is born to a pagan father and a Christian mother in the very end of the main part of the Western Roman Empire in North Africa, in a small town. He is a talented young man, and his father has ambitions for him and sends him to school to get an education to become, like he was, some sort of Roman official. And he excels, especially after he reaches Carthage and becomes essentially a professor of rhetoric, mastering classical literature and skill in public speaking. Eventually finds a career path, first as a teacher and then as a civil servant. He recounts this in his personal spiritual biography in one of the great works of the church, the Confessions. And the biography actually begins with his early childhood and talks about his being a rather willful child and the way that he was not actually drawn to either his father's paganism or his mother's Christianity. He was mostly interested in poetry and in words and in his career. So it was actually, his conversion doesn't happen actually until essentially midlife, and it is quite a dramatic conversion. And he had a productive period of time where he eventually writes a series of books, of letters, and some influential treatises that include a catechism, the Enchiridion, or a little handbook on faith, hope, and love, one of my favorite little books by Augustine. Letters, including letters about theological questions, including probably the person who wrote that Athanasian Creed that we talked about in a previous meeting. He writes a work on Christian teaching, that is, for preaching the scriptures, and includes one of the most famous and influential discussions on how to interpret scripture, especially written for people who are going to preach it. He writes, even though he is a generation after Nicaea and before Chalcedon, he writes one of the most important treatises in Latin on the nature of the Trinity. Like the Cappadocian Fathers, he has this deeply Trinitarian understanding of reality, and he uses a very complicated argument to develop that idea. He also writes, toward the end of his life, a great work of apology called The City of God, and I'll say a little more about that. And one of the last works he writes, toward the very end of his life, that says something about the way that some things that seem obvious to us developed slowly. In the ancient world, it was generally taken that when you interpreted an author, you assume that their thinking didn't change. It just maybe it developed in some ways, but they had some fundamental doctrines. Augustine actually had such a radical change in some of his opinions. He actually wrote a work where he commented on his own work, sometimes decades after he wrote it. So we actually have a record in Augustine's own hand about how he changed some of his theological and philosophical positions. And that actually makes him very unusual in the history of thought, especially in ancient thought. So here I have one of the famous medieval paintings from Fra Angelico of the conversion of St. Augustine, which involves a famous incident he recounts from his views about the pear tree. Probably the most important things that happened in Augustine's life that led him to Christianity, besides the personal relationship with his mother, is that in his studies early on, he comes across a book by Cicero, the great orator, which was now lost, but a book called the Hortensius, which was a work in dedication of someone who had influenced Cicero to find value in study for the truth, even for someone who had a very public life. Cicero himself had been a proconsul and member of the Roman Senate and one of the leading politicians in the end of the late Roman Empire, the great opponent of Julius Caesar, and Augustine was deeply influenced by this work, and he becomes convinced that some of his ambitions are ultimately vain and empty for wealth and power, and he starts to adapt a habit of life and driving friends to him who are more interested in the pursuit of truth. But this leads him initially in a funny direction. It actually leads him to a religion called Manichaeism, which is related to one of those Gnostic heresies that showed up within the church as well. It was a dualistic understanding of the world where there are two principles, essentially two gods, a principle of good and a principle of evil. And like a lot of Gnostic systems, it tended to associate the physical world with the evil God and the spiritual world with the good God. And this was sort of his starting point, as kind of an intellectualistic Gnostic understanding of the world. He would eventually become disenchanted, partly because of the lack of intellectual content and coherence of this position, and would start moving into a more philosophical position called Neoplatonism. As his career is moving up, he actually benefits by the fact that he's not a Christian. Since a lot of the Roman Empire, there was this sort of pagan versus Christian tension within the court. So he actually is following this path, and it's actually against his own career interest. He begins listening to some of his friends and to his mother that maybe he should go hear this Christian bishop named Ambrose in Milan, which is where the court was holding, the Roman court had moved to northern Italy. And Ambrose was known as a great preacher, and Augustine sort of went mostly out of sort of professional interest. He wanted to hear this person, not because he was interested in the Christianity, but was interested in his rhetoric. But he becomes so taken and enchanted, he eventually befriends Ambrose, and Ambrose eventually baptizes him as a Christian. And he immediately gives up his position at court and retreats to his home back in North Africa. So think of just how significant that kind of move is. He ends up giving away most of his wealth as well as his position. It would be there that his friendship with the bishop there, a man by the name of Valerius, that he would eventually be taken out of the life of sort of reclusion. He actually sort of created sort of a community of fellow Christians to kind of, not quite a monastery situation, but definitely a situation where they were mostly devoted to study as lay people. His bishop, though, calls him and tries to convince him to take on orders. And Augustine is actually ordained as a bishop without going through what we now think of as the normal sequence. And he would eventually succeed the bishop in North Africa, and would then use his position to address various controversies that would arise, as happens always in the church, including the Donatists and the Pelagians, which are probably the most important. There's far more of this story to be told, and I hope that you become interested enough to do it. But I want to talk about the Donatist controversy in a little more detail, because it's going to influence some of the other points about Augustine's thinking about the church. The Donatists had preceded in North Africa Augustine's coming as a bishop. And they originally began during the Diocletian, or following the Diocletian persecution around 311. And the question arose among priests and bishops about what are called the lapsed, those who during that persecution renounced their Christianity to avoid the persecution. And some of those people included priests and bishops, and then they returned to the church afterwards. So the question came whether the sacraments including baptism, that those priests had performed were actually valid. And the Donatists came to the belief that following the old rule from Cyprian, that sacraments that are not valid outside the church, and they thought that those persons, having renounced Christ, weren't the church. So their baptisms and their Eucharists were not valid. Jeremy, did you have a question for me there?
Okay, yeah, I think you answered it. I was going to ask you who were the Donatists, but you pretty much answered it after you kept going there for a minute.
So and the Donatists actually, and if I can use an analogy here, this is something that happens again and again in the church. It happened previously with that group that Tertullian was involved in called the Mountainists. And here it is again, that there are some people in the church who believes that the church consists only of the saints, the saved, and that those who are sinners are not actually properly part of the church. Augustine is going to develop some of his positions about the nature of the church and the sacrament in contrast to the Donatists. But this is something that is going to continue to show up in the church. You still see this thread, for instance, in some fundamentalist groups in the Christianity, that basically if you, after you're baptized, if you sin, then you have to be cast out of the church with no ability for repentance. Augustinians have always seen a major role for the role of reconciliation. And part of that story that we get in our Anglican service at Easter about the traditional time for the restoration of penitence, that actually dates and was significantly influenced by the story that Augustine tells in his Confessions, part of his own experience, both as a convert and as a bishop. Another controversy that shows up is sadly one of the first times that England shows up in the church history. There was a monk who, traveling from England, visited Rome and meets a group of Christians who had been influenced by Augustine, and has a very violent reaction, in terms of argumentatively violent reaction to the theology of Augustine about the role of grace. Pelagian took the side that human beings have free will, and on his view, that means that all sin ultimately comes down to our individual wills choosing to do evil. So importantly, he took the view that infants don't need to be baptized because they haven't actually committed any sins yet, so they don't need the forgiveness that baptism comes from. And Augustine is going to be very much involved in the early response to this particular heresy. And interestingly enough, sort of both positions that people take within the Western Church are variations of the Augustinian answer, sort of putting different emphasis on grace versus human nature, human will. That is a very, very brief intro into that. So when Augustine starts to try to articulate some basic questions through his preachings, through his ministry, both for some monastic groups and as what we would now call a diocesan bishop, he has a strong influence from this Platonism, but that he also has a strong reaction to some of those earlier Platonists, like Origen. He's very careful to make sure that his particular theology renounces that Manichaean dualism, that God is a single creator, that he is good, and that he created things good. And that evil, in some ways, flows from a failure of God's purposes. Evil is a deprivation of good, is an idea that very much is a development out of a kind of Platonist idea, but it's one that's thoroughly within a Christian context. It is not that dualistic position that you see where you have two equal principles. And his doctrine of creation very much tries to draw that out in his interpretation of Genesis, which actually is where the last few chapters of the Confession actually go. When he comes to questions about free will, about sin, and about human nature, he's taking that idea into account. He thinks that what happened at the fall actually corrupted not just our individual wills, but it had an effect on our nature. Our actual human nature was corrupted. And this is consistent with that thought from the Nicene period, is that God has to reconcile our human nature. He doesn't replace it. He cures it. So this is a strong view that's been in the formulation that Augustine has, that has generally influenced the Western thought about the idea of original sin. You may remember that some of the early church fathers didn't have quite that view. They actually had a view that was closer to Pelagius, Irenaeus being one of them. It's also because of that view about the fall of human nature, Augustine was very clear that we cannot by our own choices be saved, that the first step has to come from God. So he takes the view in the scriptural passages about predestination to mean that, in some sense, God has predestined some people to be the saved and some people to be lost. Even if we can't know from our human point of view who those are, God does. And this isn't just a matter of God foreseeing how we would act. It actually has to do with that he actually has given the grace to act freely for some people, and he has deprived that from other people. This basic view, in working out sort of the two different sides of it, give two very different answers to some basic questions about, what it means for a human being to be free. I would love to give lectures on Augustine, and when I actually used to teach medieval theology, I spent weeks on Augustine. But for this talk, I wanted to actually bring out something else that came out of that Donatist company. That Augustine is, among other things, where we get the word sacrament, the idea of an outward and visible sign for an inward and invisible grace. That's his definition. It was his developing of the nature of language and also about the rights of the church. And in those controversies, he makes a distinction. Cyprian had talked about the validity of sacraments, and that's been the way that the church, East and West, has generally understood it. That, for instance, baptism must use a Trinitarian formula to be valid. But Augustine develops the doctrine, which in the West has been very clearly articulated and is roughly held in the East as well, that because the actions of the sacraments are done by God, the validity of them being vouched for by the church, but they do not in any way depend on the worthiness of the ministers, the officiants. So in baptism, that would usually be the priest, or in Eucharist. So the question that the Donatists were asking, Augustine has no problem saying that the people that they had baptized, were validly baptized, even if they were not, as he liked to put it, regularly baptized. So we sometimes still deal with this question: do you have to be rebaptized, when you join a particular denomination? The Western Church has generally said that if you're baptized in a Trinitarian formula, even if your group in some sense had doctrine relative to the group that you're joining now had wrong doctrine, you don't get rebaptized. So interestingly enough, this shows the communion, even if there are these deep differences between some various Protestant groups in the Roman Catholic Church. If you're an Anglican and you convert to Catholicism, or Catholic and you convert to Anglicanism, you're not rebaptized. You've been a Christian. You are just now under a different authority, and those are the kinds of questions and those kinds of distinctions. And that the reason why we think in those ways go back to this particular set of doctrines. Also, that conviction that the church is mixed is something that is important there. And Augustine's way of articulating this has generally been the main way to understand it, that the church, the visible and invisible body, is holy, not because of the people in it, but because Jesus Christ is holy. And if you ever hear that formula, that goes back to this particular line of thinking, in thinking about the church and the sacraments. That salvation is, on Augustine's view, only within the visible church. You cannot be saved outside of the visible church. But he's willing to say that there is some doubt sometimes about where exactly the boundaries of the visible church are. And where those boundaries are sometimes come down to the validity of things like baptism. There's also another thought strand in Augustine's thought that's important for talking about the church history, namely history. Augustine is generally credited with the origin of the idea of telling history from a Christian perspective and in a sort of a chronological way, understanding as the unfolding of both visible and invisible themes. And this is in one of the great work called The City of God. And in that work, the main thrust of it is, interestingly enough, an apology for the Christian church. After the fall of Rome in 410, Christians were accused of causing the fall of the Roman Empire through their immorality. And Augustine's claim is that actually no, that it is true that God sometimes works through visible things like countries, empires, but its purpose having been achieved, God no longer kept it into existence. And Augustine has this view that there are spiritual purposes and human purposes, and there are those cities, those groups of people like the church, which are aimed at love and love of God primarily, and those organizations that are aimed at man and his own loves, his what we probably call his selfishness. And we have to understand some aspects of this world, the visible world, as serving goals that are subordinate to spiritual ends, while not themselves, in some sense, under the province of the church. You're starting to hear some of the differences between church and state. Augustine is very much starting to set out some of those distinctions that become part of our contemporary political philosophy. One of the other enduring features of this is the idea that there are moral limits to the things that states do. And this is the origin of the so-called just war theory. And if you want a stark difference between Western history and, say, the histories of other peoples, like the Chinese, it's the absence of total war after the rise of Christianity. The idea that the Romans had, that it's okay sometimes just to completely annihilate people because you're more powerful than them, goes away. The idea that just murdering innocent people is just for political power is, morally speaking, no, even if it's the case that some Western leaders did not always abide by the strictures of just war. It was held up at least as an ideal, and part of that goes back to Augustine.
Greg, can I ask a question?
You may. Please interrupt me.
So remind me of the timeline in comparison to the Eastern people you were talking about last week. Are these on a similar timeline? Did Augustine come after them?
So Augustine is, if we can let's put this on a timeline. Augustine is born after the First Church Council of Nicaea. He is alive at the same time as some of the early church, some of the Nicene fathers. Like Athanasius dies around 373. So Augustine's conversion is happening about the same time that some of that first generation. So the Cappadocians, some of them are still alive, sort of but he is a younger generation. He is in that second group and third group about the church councils. So he is alive, but not participating in the church council at of Constantinople, the one that modified and responded to the Apollinarians. But remember, that was mostly on the Eastern Church, because that was mostly he does not live to see the church council in Ephesus, but one of his several of his close students do, and they do influence those conflicts about Nestorianism. In fact, several people there have a distinctly Augustinian answer to the Nestorian heresy. And by the time you get to Chalcedon in 451, the Western Church, most of its theologians, and partly because of some influences and things that happened in France, are deeply influenced by Augustine, even though Augustine is physically, had already passed by that point.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah. It's just
so this is going on in the West.
Right, because you're having to separate them, because otherwise it would get so confusing. I just was wondering how much kind of crossover in thought there was.
So while the Eastern churches were focusing on those heresies, Pelagianism does show up as one of the secondary issues in a council that happens in his diocese about 418.
Hey,
And
great.
And Ephesus in 431 actually does address that. And that actually settles the question that Pelagianism is a heresy. So that actually gets repeated in another church council that we may get to talk about, called the Council of Orange in 529, which is another church council that would be important for some other reasons relative to the East. So yeah, so all these things are happening at the same time. As much as I would love to talk about Augustine for, well, I could go on and on and on. Let me kind of wrap up, just kind of having set some of those themes. Let me wrap up by talking a little bit about some other things that were going on in the Western part of the church. And part of it goes right to Augustine, that some of these disputes about the nature of grace and predestination between Pelagianism and others brought out some of the features about that predestination that leads to another set of arguments. And this is somewhat rather confusing, but the general idea is by the time you get to 529, so over 100 years of people, bishops addressing some of these questions and finding points, that generally the church, the Western church at least, agrees on what's called a semi-Augustinian position and allows a semi-Pelagian position, but is reluctant to fully adopt that strong position on predestination, and also condemns the Pelagian position, specifically under the formulation that it actually says that it cannot be the case that of any human being, except in Christ and his divinity and humanity, can be without sin, understood to mean that he had the ability to not to sin. All of us are, in some sense, because of the corruption of our nature, did not have that ability. So that's where the church came down. But part of it has to do with understanding that doctrine of predestination. And there is a kind of a movement back and forth, and it is with some accuracy that later church historians will say that much of what goes on in the disputes leading to the Protestant Reformation are actually revival of issues about Augustinian. Jumping forward almost 1,000 years, it was an Augustinian monk by the name of Luther who takes the stronger side on predestination, and Calvin, a generation following him. And the great humanist Erasmus defended the semi-Pelagian position, the one that gives more weight to human will and still acknowledges, but does not gives quite as strength to the role of grace, especially how sort of the mechanism of grace is supposed to work. So those set of controversies, including men like John Cassian, and eventually an important theologian, two generations later at the Council of Orange, an Augustinian bishop and theologian by the name of Prosper of Aquitaine. Now, notice I've started talking about some names that don't sound Greek, and they don't really sound Roman anymore, because it turns out that a lot of the areas that we would now associate with France and Spain become important centers of Christianity, especially the south of France. And one of the disputes that also happens during this time is a revival there's a bishop who is accused of another Sabellianism, the modalism. And it would be an Augustinian, actually a friend of Augustinian by the name of Orosius, who would write against the Nestorians and also write against this new version of Sabellianism. And during that council at Ephesus would speak on renewing that part of the creed against that kind of modalistic understanding. Orosius also was interesting because he wrote an appendix to Augustine's City of God and re-emphasized and was sort of set him more into this idea of telling history from a Christian point of view. And this idea that Christ is the axis mundi, the center of the world, and to understand the history of the world and sort of where it's going, you have to look to Christianity is going to be an important idea. It's built there right into our calendar, right? Dating history based on Christ's life. There's going to be another dispute, which I'm going to speak briefly because it will show up throughout the medieval period. And it's going to show up because of another Christian writing here in you can see after Augustine, by a generation 480 to 524, the Roman Empire is kind of broken up. He is in the north of Italy, in a kingdom which is now actually just a part of, it's basically mostly just Italy, under a Gothic king basically ruling part of the Roman Empire. And Boethius was an educated Christian, writing on the Trinity, and had the ambition to eventually translate many of the Greek works that influenced Christian theology into Latin. So part of his contribution is that he did succeed in getting some works, among others, by Aristotle translated, before he was actually executed for treason or alleged treason in 524 by the emperor. In doing so, he gave us the language in the Western Church, including the words person, substance, being, or at least the Latin equivalent, that would influence the way that our vocabulary developed. And you remember that there was this vocabulary difference. So he was working on that issue in defending the Nicene result and trying to clarify how to do that in Latin. If Augustine's work on the Trinity is less influential, it's only because Boethius's vocabulary was generally regarded to be a clearer, from a doctrinal point of view, of putting those questions forward. And if you remember in my little chart about the understanding what's going on in the various heresies, I talked about the levels on which you talk about, being and, essence and natures. And when you're talking about general categories of things, you are in that part of philosophy, that part of metaphysics called the problem of universals. And this has been a feature of philosophical thinking, at least since the time of Plato and Aristotle. And Boethius took a particular view and translated some of Aristotle and work on this, that tied the defense of Christian doctrines to a particular understanding of those questions. You can see in giving that doctrine, we had assumed a particular way of answering those kinds of questions. And this would lead to later disputes, as some later theologians and philosophers, and including Christian philosophers, came to doubt that view of what is ultimately a technical, philosophical, and logical question. And that would actually occupy the center of some of the medieval universities and break different schools of thought on the basis of this question. Also, lining up with another dispute, it was, in some people's view, significant that the monk Martin Luther actually was educated in a school of nominalism, which was opposed to the more realist interpretation that dominated the Roman Catholic schools, including most of the the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church at the time of Luther. So there's actually this philosophical dispute about even understanding the philosophy behind the language that is still reverberating down through Protestantism. There's actually several theologians who have suggested that the dispute between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism is fundamentally two different views on the problem of universals. I don't think that's quite right, but it gets something about the way about language and reality and God connect. My last little bit of this story, and really what I'm doing is trying to tell a story about the Western Church, goes to now a little later, 590 to 604. We're starting to actually be in what we would now visibly recognize as the medieval period. There were, in Augustine's time, these questions between the empire and the church, which took a different form than they did in the Eastern Church, where the bishop, especially the Bishop of Constantinople, and the emperor were much more closely aligned. Since there was no unified political power, the church, in some ways, was able to be both distinct and also to claim a position relative to some of the controversial issues of the day, sort of above various kind of secular rulers. Center of that, and one of the most important for setting the shape of the way the Western Church would be someone who would argue for greater papal power on exactly that point, by the name of Gregory, Pope Gregory, the Bishop of Rome, from 590 to 604. Called the Great in the Roman tradition. He's actually labeled as one of the four great doctors of the church. He was someone who came through from the monastic side of the church and was thoroughly Augustinian in his theology, if somewhat unoriginal. his greatness, if you want to put it that way, had to do with both reforming and developing the church in several ways. And several of the features of the liturgy date to his time, including Gregorian chant, development of church law, canon law, as its own standing law parallel to the secular law. He was one of the great popes of missions, sending missions to all sorts of unchurched people, many of them outside of, or on the, you might say, outside the influence of the Latin-speaking world. So Augustine, this is not Augustine of Hippo, this is Augustine of Canterbury, was sent as a missionary to England, and that is where the first monastery in the south of England is founded because of the mission of a small group of monks sent by Gregory to Christianize that, or at least to spread the Western form of Christianity there. There'll be an interesting, in the next few hundred years, interaction, because there's some Christians mainly in Ireland, would interact with these Western Christians, and the Celtic church would eventually become blended with the more Latin church through the various machinations of English history. Gregory also contributed to various aesthetic practices and was a great preacher. Preaching was still, in this early medieval place, one of the great ways of growing the church. One of the strands that's going to happen later that gets lost in some of the way that some of Gregory's liturgical developments happen. Also significant for things that would happen in the medieval period. Gregory the Great was very much mitigated. He was weak on some of those doctrines about predestination, and correspondingly thought that there was a larger role for penance for sinners within the church. And it was in that sense that he was one of the first people to develop the doctrine of purgatory, which is going to have an important history as we get into the developments of things like indulgences that would be, in the view of many of the reformers, some of the abuses of the medieval church. You also see, and you'll hear this one show up in some...
Now who came up with purgatory?
This is Gregory the Great developing some ideas that were in Augustine about the nature of predestination. And so this becomes one of the ideas that would dominate medieval Christianity. It goes specifically to, it has roots in Augustine, but this is where it comes from. Some of the actual liturgical practices and some of the prayers that date to the time of Gregory the Great. And there are these theological themes. The idea that if we die with sins, what happens to us? That's where ultimately this doctrine of purgatory was trying to explain, is that maybe there is a period of before our approach to the final throne, and maybe even before the final judgment, that we can engage in a kind of cleansing before we approach God in His holiness. And this developed the idea that maybe the things that we do here, praying for people who have already passed from our point of view, that we can do things for them, that we can help them out. And that's where the doctrine of purgatory gets developed. Also, for people in the Catholic tradition, the Western Catholic tradition, is the idea of the Mass as a sacrifice. That this is going to that very realistic interpretation of what's going on. And Gregory's thought would become so canonical that most of the memorialist views aren't even considered in the Western Church for that reason. And at least in my view, one of the weaknesses of Gregory is that some of the greatness and really the brilliance of Augustine is lost and replaced with what seems to me a much more superstitious, with more Protestant eyes, some of the more superstitious practices of the medieval church. Many of the saints' lives that were written into some of the medieval liturgies, if some of you are familiar with some of the old forms, some of these stories involve, missionaries, performing these miracles that I have to say, I have some grain of doubt about whether those are actually true. There's also a strong emphasis on things like guardian angels, and that also goes back to Gregory the Great and some of his practices that he encouraged. So these are all things that start to mark off the Western Church in some distinct ways from the East. So again, I hope that part of the story becomes interesting. We will continue next week by picking up with some of what's going on about that same time in the East. The special emphasis by the disputes about icons